She came just to watch. Her tattoo silenced the SEAL commander. There are moments in life that break you. Not the kind of breaking where you fall apart and someone picks you up. No, the kind where you crack so deep inside that no one can see it. You walk, you talk, you smile, and the whole world thinks you are fine. But inside, there is a silence that never goes away. This is a story about that kind of silence. This is a story about a woman who carried a name on her skin and a fire in her chest. She did not come to speak. She did not come to be seen. She came just to watch. But what she carried on her body would stop a room full of the toughest men in the world. And the man standing at the front, a Navy SEAL commander with 30 years of war behind his eyes, would lose his voice for the first time in his life. Not because of a bullet, not because of a bomb, but because of a tattoo on a woman's wrist. If you think strength only lives in muscles and medals, then you have never met someone like her. Stay with this story. Every word of it is worth your time, because by the end you will understand that the loudest thing in any room is not a voice. It is the truth someone has been carrying alone for too long. The morning was cool and grey. A soft wind came off the ocean and moved across the sand like a whisper. Coronado Beach stretched wide and flat, under a sky that could not decide whether to rain or shine. It was early, just past 7 in the morning, and most of the town was still asleep. But on the Naval Special Warfare Center grounds, there was already movement. Men in uniform walked quickly between buildings. Trucks rolled across gravel paths. Flags stood stiff in the wind. Today was graduation day, not for a school, not for a college. This was the day when a new class of Navy SEALs would receive their trident pins. The Golden Eagle holding a trident, a flintlock pistol, and an anchor. The most respected military badge in the world. Only the strongest, the most determined, the most mentally unbreakable men earned the right to wear it. And today, 26 of them would stand in a line and feel that cold metal pressed into their chests for the first time. Commander Daniel Hale stood in front of a mirror inside the base headquarters. He was 54 years old. His hair was cut short and had turned silver at the edges. His face was hard, lined with deep creases that came from years of sun, salt, and sleepless nights in places most people would never know existed. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, and they carried a heaviness that never fully lifted. He had served for over 3 decades. He had been deployed more times than he could count. He had lost friends. He had buried brothers. He had made decisions in the dark that saved lives and decisions that ended them. And now he was the one who stood at the front and welcomed the new ones in. He adjusted his medals, straightened his collar, and looked at his own reflection. He did not smile. He never smiled on graduation day. Because every time he pinned a trident on a young man's chest, he thought about all the ones who had worn it before and were no longer alive. Outside, the families had started to arrive. Mothers in nice dresses, fathers in pressed shirts, brothers and sisters holding small American flags. There were girlfriends too, some of them crying already, proud and scared at the same time. The bleachers were set up on a wide concrete area near the beach, and one by one the seats began to fill. There was excitement in the air. Laughter, nervous energy, camera flashes, children running between legs. It was the kind of scene you would see in a movie about heroes. And in many ways, that is exactly what it was. But there was one woman who did not fit into any of those groups. She arrived alone. She came on foot, walking slowly from the direction of the main road. She wore a plain, dark blue dress that reached just below her knees. Her shoes were flat, black, and simple. Her hair was dark brown, pulled back into a low knot at the base of her neck. She wore no jewelry, no earrings, no necklace, no ring. She carried nothing in her hands, no purse, no phone, no camera. She walked like someone who had practiced being invisible. Her steps were quiet. Her eyes were forward. Her face showed nothing, not happiness, not sadness. Just a calm, still expression that looked like it had been frozen there for a very long time. She found a seat at the far end of the last row of bleachers, the spot no one else wanted because it was too far from the stage and partly blocked by a pole. She sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and looked straight ahead. She did not talk to anyone. No one talked to her. In a crowd full of proud families and emotional loved ones, she sat like a ghost, present but barely there. Her name was Elena Vasquez. She was 41 years old. She had driven 14 hours through the night from a small town in West Texas to be here. She had not slept. She had not eaten since the day before. She had not told anyone where she was going. She had simply gotten into her old pickup truck at 4 in the afternoon and driven west until the land turned into ocean. And now she was here, sitting in the last row, watching. No one knew her story. No one knew what she had been through. No one knew what she carried on the inside of her left wrist, hidden under the long sleeve of her dress. And no one knew that her being here, in this place, on this day, was the result of a promise she had made 7 years ago to a man who never came home. The ceremony began at exactly 0900 hours. A military band played a short piece. The American flag was raised. The national anthem echoed across the grounds and everyone stood. Elena stood too, her hand over her heart, her lips pressed together tight. When the music ended and people sat back down, she lowered herself slowly, as if the weight of everything she was holding had suddenly doubled. Commander Hale walked to the podium. He stood tall, his back straight, his hands gripping the edges of the wooden stand. He looked out at the crowd and nodded once. Then he began to speak. His voice was deep and steady. He talked about honor, about sacrifice, about what it meant to serve not for glory, but for the person standing next to you. He talked about the men who had gone through the hardest military training in the world and had refused to quit. He talked about the ones who had rung the bell and walked away, and how that was not weakness but honesty. He talked about the weight of the trident, not the physical weight, but the weight of what it represented. Every name that had ever been engraved on a memorial wall. Every flag that had been folded and handed to a mother. Every brother who had gone out on a mission and never returned. He spoke about all of it with a voice that did not waver. But if you looked closely at his hands, you could see them shaking. Just slightly. Just enough to know that every word cost him something. Elena listened to every word. She did not move. She did not blink. She sat perfectly still and let the words wash over her like water. And somewhere deep inside her chest, a door that she had kept locked for 7 years began to rattle. After the speech, the pinning began. One by one, the graduates walked forward. Their families stood up. Mothers cried. Fathers saluted. Commanders pressed the trident pin into each man's chest, pushing it firmly into the fabric, a tradition that went back decades. The sound of palms slapping against metal echoed across the yard. Each hit was meant to push the pin deeper, to remind the new SEAL that this symbol was now part of him. Flesh and blood and metal, all bound together. Elena watched every single one. She watched the faces of the young men, full of pride and fire, and the kind of hope that only comes when you do not yet know what war really looks like. She watched the families embrace. She watched the tears. She watched the joy. And with every pin that was pressed into a chest, she felt her own heart crack a little more. Because 7 years ago, there had been a man standing in that same line. Tall, strong, smiling wider than anyone else in the room. A man with dark eyes and a laugh that could fill a whole building. A man who had turned to the crowd after receiving his trident and looked directly at her, only at her, and mouthed the words, "I did it for you." His name was Marco Antonio Vasquez. He was her husband. He was 29 years old when he stood in that line. He was 31 when he died. He was killed during a night operation in a country whose name was never made public. The details of the mission were classified. The military gave her a flag, a letter, and a box of personal items. That was it. No body. No funeral with a casket. Just an empty grave with a headstone and a name that the world would never know. She buried an empty box in the red dirt of West Texas and stood there alone in the rain while a pastor read verses she could not hear over the sound of her own silence. For 7 years, Elena had lived with that silence. She went back to her job at the elementary school in town. She taught 2nd grade. She smiled at the children. She helped them learn their letters and their numbers. She went home every evening to a house that was too quiet and sat in a chair that used to be his and stared at a wall that still had his picture on it. She did not date. She did not go out. She did not talk about Marco to anyone because every time she tried, her throat would close up and the words would dissolve before they reached her lips. People in town stopped asking after the first 2 years. They figured she had moved on. They figured she was fine. They had no idea that every single night she sat in the dark and held a folded flag against her chest and whispered his name until she fell asleep. The tattoo came 3 years after his death. She had never wanted a tattoo before. She had never even thought about it. But one night, she woke up from a dream where Marco was standing in front of her, alive, real, close enough to touch. He was smiling. He reached out and took her hand. And on his wrist, she saw something she had never seen before. A set of coordinates. Numbers, latitude and longitude. She woke up gasping, her heart pounding so hard she thought it would break through her ribs. She grabbed a pen from the nightstand and wrote the numbers down on her palm before she could forget them. The next morning, she typed them into a computer. The coordinates pointed to a location in a country she had never been to, a remote valley surrounded by mountains. She stared at the screen for a long time. Then she understood. That was where he died. Those were the coordinates of the place where Marco took his last breath. She did not know how she knew this. She had never been given that information. But deep inside her bones, she felt the truth of it, like a bell ringing in an empty church. She drove to a tattoo shop in El Paso 3 days later and had the coordinates inked on the inside of her left wrist, small, clean, black numbers on pale skin. No decoration, no design, just numbers, just a location, just the last place on earth where her husband had been alive. She wore long sleeves after that, always. Even in the Texas summer heat, she kept her wrists covered. It was not shame. It was privacy. That tattoo was not for the world. It was for her. It was her way of carrying him. Her way of saying, I know where you are. I will always know where you are. And now, 7 years later, she was sitting in the last row of bleachers at Coronado, watching a new class of SEALs receive the same pin that Marco had received. She had not planned to come. She had not even thought about it until 3 weeks ago when she was cleaning out the whole closet and found an old envelope tucked inside one of his boots. She had gone through his things hundreds of times over the years, but somehow she had missed this envelope. It was sealed. Her name was written on the front in his handwriting. She stared at it for 10 full minutes before she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and on it, in Marco's messy, beautiful handwriting, were these words. Elena, if you are reading this, then I did not come home. I'm sorry. I am sorry for every morning you will wake up alone. I am sorry for every night you will go to bed without me. But I need you to do something for me. I need you to go back. Go back to Coronado. Go back to the place where I became who I was meant to be. Watch the next class graduate. Watch them stand in that line. Watch them receive their trident. And when you see them, know that I am standing with them. I will always be standing with them. And I will always be standing with you. Do not hide, Elena. Do not disappear. Let them see you. Let them know that behind every man who serves, there is someone who waits. And that waiting is its own kind of bravery. I love you more than I ever had the words to say, Marco. She had read the letter 11 times that night. She read it until the words blurred and her tears made the ink run. And then, without thinking, without planning, without telling a single soul, she decided to go. She decided to keep her promise. She decided to go back to Coronado and watch. Just watch. She did not want to speak. She did not want to be noticed. She just wanted to be there, the way Marco had asked. She wanted to sit in the crowd and feel close to him one more time. She wanted to breathe the same salty air he had breathed. She wanted to hear the same words he had heard. She wanted to see the same pride in the eyes of young men who did not yet know what they were about to give up. The ceremony continued. Names were called. Pins were pressed. Families cheered. And Elena sat still in the last row, her hands folded, her face calm, her heart breaking and healing at the same time. She did not know that in less than 1 hour everything would change. She did not know that Commander Daniel Hale would walk through the crowd after the ceremony, shaking hands and thanking families, and that his path would bring him directly to the last row of bleachers. She did not know that a gust of wind would catch the edge of her sleeve at the exact moment he passed by. She did not know that he would glance down and see the numbers on her wrist, and she did not know that those numbers, those specific coordinates, would hit him like a bullet through the chest, because Commander Daniel Hale knew those coordinates. He knew them by heart. He had memorized them years ago and had carried them every single day since. Those coordinates were the place where he had lost 3 of his men on a mission that went wrong. One of those men was a young SEAL with dark eyes and a wide smile who had told his commander, just before they boarded the helicopter that night, that he had a wife back home who was waiting for him. His name was Marco Antonio Vasquez. And the woman sitting in the last row with his final resting place tattooed on her wrist was the wife he never came back to. Commander Hale stopped walking. His feet locked to the ground as if roots had grown from his boots into the concrete. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His eyes fixed on the tattoo. Then slowly, they moved up to her face. Elena looked back at him. And in that one look, in that one silent moment between 2 strangers who were not strangers at all, the entire world went quiet. The cheering faded. The music disappeared. The wind stopped blowing. And all that was left was the truth, written in ink on a woman's wrist and burned into a commander's memory. 2 people. 1 loss. And 7 years of silence that was about to end. Commander Daniel Hale had been shot at in 4 different countries. He had been ambushed in the mountains of Afghanistan. He had crawled through mud and blood on missions that the world would never hear about. He had held dying men in his arms and told them it was going to be okay when he knew it was not. He had faced things that would destroy most people. And through all of it, he had never once frozen. His training had made him into a man who could move when others could not, think when others panicked, speak when others went silent. But now, standing 3 feet from a woman in a dark blue dress, he could not move. He could not speak. He could not breathe. The numbers on her wrist had reached into his chest and grabbed his heart with both hands. He knew those coordinates the way a person knows their own name. They were not just numbers to him. They were a place. A real place with dust and rock and thin mountain air. A place where the stars looked different because you were so high up that the sky seemed closer. A place where 3 men he had trained, led, fought beside, and loved like brothers had drawn their last breath. He had carried those numbers in his mind for 7 years. He had whispered them to himself in the dark on the worst nights. He had traced them with his finger on maps when no one was looking. And now those same numbers were tattooed on the wrist of a woman who was looking up at him with eyes that held the same broken quiet he saw in his own reflection every morning. Elena did not move from her seat. She did not stand. She did not pull her sleeve down to cover the tattoo. The wind had already done its work. The numbers were visible, and there was no point in hiding them now. She simply looked at the commander and waited. She did not know who he was beyond his rank and the medals on his chest. She did not know his connection to Marco. She did not know that this man had been the one to plan the mission, to give the order, to send her husband into that valley. All she knew was that a decorated Navy SEAL commander was standing in front of her, staring at her wrist, and his face had turned the color of ash. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The crowd continued to celebrate around them. Families were taking photographs. Young SEALs were laughing and hugging their mothers. Music was playing from a small speaker near the stage. The world was loud and alive and full of joy. But in the small space between Elena and Commander Hale, there was nothing but silence. A silence so thick you could lean against it. Then Hale spoke. His voice came out low and rough, like a door being opened that had been sealed shut for years. He said just 2 words. Those numbers. That was all. Those numbers. Elena tilted her head slightly. She looked at him more carefully now, reading his face the way you read a letter that you are afraid to understand. She saw the recognition in his eyes. She saw the pain. She saw something that looked like guilt. And in that moment, a cold understanding began to move through her body like ice water filling her veins. This man knew the coordinates. This man knew the place. This man had been there. She opened her mouth and her voice was soft, barely louder than the wind. You know where this is. It was not a question. It was a statement. Hale nodded. His jaw was tight. His hands, which had been steady enough to fire weapons in total darkness, were trembling at his sides. He looked down at the ground for a moment, then back at her. He said, I was there that night. The words hit Elena like a wall of water. She had spent 7 years not knowing. 7 years in the dark, filling the empty spaces with imagination, with nightmares, with questions that had no answers. She had begged the military for information. She had written letters to every office she could find. She had called numbers that rang and were never answered. She had been told that the mission was classified, that the details could not be shared, that she should focus on healing and moving forward. Moving forward. As if a person could move forward when they did not even know how the person they loved most in the world had died. As if healing was possible without knowing the truth. And now, standing in front of her in a decorated uniform, was a man who had been there. A man who had seen it. A man who might be able to tell her the one thing she needed to know more than anything else in the world. What happened to Marco? She stood up slowly. Her legs felt weak, but she locked her knees and steadied herself. She was shorter than Hale by nearly a foot, but in that moment, standing face to face with him, she felt enormous. She felt like the biggest person in the world, because she was finally close to the truth she had been chasing for 7 years. She looked into his eyes and said, "My husband was Marco Vasquez. He was killed on a mission. They never told me anything. They never told me how. They never told me where. They never even gave me his body to bury. I buried an empty box in the ground, and I have been talking to dirt for 7 years." She paused and lifted her wrist so that the tattoo was directly in his line of sight. "These numbers came to me in a dream. I do not know how. I do not know why. But I know they are real. I know this is where he died. And now you are telling me you were there. So I need you to tell me what happened. I need you to tell me everything." Hale stared at her. His chest was rising and falling faster now. The people around them had started to notice that something was happening. A few families nearby had gone quiet, watching the commander and this unknown woman having what was clearly not a casual conversation. One of the younger officers on the base started walking toward them, sensing that something might be wrong, but Hale held up his hand without looking and the officer stopped in his tracks. Hale took a breath, then another. He was fighting a war inside himself. Everything in his training told him that the mission was classified, that he could not share details with a civilian, not even a widow, that the information was locked behind walls of security clearance and legal authority. But everything in his heart told him that this woman had earned the truth. She had driven through the night. She had come alone. She had sat in the last row and watched other men receive the same honor her husband had received before he was sent to die. She had the coordinates of his death tattooed on her body. She had been waiting 7 years. And she was asking him, not as a stranger, not as a journalist, not as someone trying to expose secrets, but as a wife, as a woman who just wanted to know what happened to the man she loved. He looked around. The crowd was thinning. Families were beginning to move toward the reception area where tables had been set up with food and drinks. The bleachers were emptying. He turned back to Elena and said, "Not here. Please, come with me. There is a place we can talk." Elena hesitated for only a second. Then she nodded. She followed him. They walked away from the bleachers, away from the crowd, away from the celebration. They walked across the base, past the training buildings, past the barracks, past the obstacle course where men were broken and rebuilt. They walked in silence, side by side, like two people heading towards something they both feared but could not avoid. Hale led her to a small building at the edge of the base, near the water. It was a chapel, a simple structure with white walls, wooden pews, and a cross above the door. Dead. It was empty. The door was unlocked. They went inside. The light inside was dim and golden. Small windows let in thin beams of sun that landed on the floor like fallen ribbons. The air smelled like old wood and salt. Elena sat in the second pew. Hale sat in the pew across the aisle from her. They were close enough to speak quietly, but far enough apart that neither one felt crowded. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The chapel was so quiet that Elena could hear the ocean through the walls. Then Hale began to talk. He did not start with the mission. He did not start with the night Marco died. He started with the first time he met him. He told Elena that Marco had walked into basic underwater demolition SEAL training on a hot July morning with a grin on his face that made the instructors want to wipe it off. He said Marco was not the fastest, he was not the strongest, he was not the loudest. But he was the one who never stopped. When other men quit, Marco kept going. When other men cried, Marco encouraged them. When other men rang the bell and walked away, Marco stood next to the ones who were thinking about it and talked them out of it. He told Elena that during Hell Week, the 5.5 days of continuous training with almost no sleep, Marco had kept his entire boat crew going by telling them stories. Funny stories. Ridiculous stories. Stories about growing up in Texas, about his grandmother's cooking, about the time he tried to ride a bull at a county fair and lasted exactly 1.5 seconds. He had made them laugh when laughing should have been impossible. And when it was over, when they had survived, Marco had looked at his commander and said, "That was the second hardest thing I have ever done." Marco had smiled and said, "Asking my wife to marry me? I was so scared I forgot the question halfway through." Eleanor's hand went to her mouth. A sound came out of her that was not a laugh and not a cry, but something in between. Something that had been trapped inside her for so long that it did not know what shape to take when it finally escaped. She pressed her fingers against her lips and closed her eyes. She could hear Marco's voice in those words. She could see his face, his stupid, beautiful, crooked grin. She could feel him in the room, as if the chapel had brought him closer. Hale continued. He told her about the months of advanced training, about how Marco had become one of the best operators in his class, about how he had a gift for reading situations, for knowing when to move and when to wait, for staying calm when chaos erupted around him. He told her that Marco had been assigned to SEAL Team 4 and had deployed twice before the night of the final mission. Both deployments had been successful. Marco had performed beyond expectations. He had saved lives. He had earned the respect of every man on his team. And on the night of his third deployment, the night he did not come back, he had volunteered. Nobody had asked him to go. The mission was dangerous, more dangerous than usual, and the team lead had asked for volunteers. Marco had stepped forward before anyone else. When Hale asked him why, Marco had said something that Hale had never forgotten. He said, "Because if something goes wrong, I would rather it happen to me than to someone who has not had the chance to live the kind of life I have lived. I have had the best life, Commander. I married the best woman in the world. I have known what it feels like to be loved completely. If tonight is my last night, then I have already won." Elena was crying now, not loudly, not dramatically. The tears moved down her face like rain on glass, slow and steady and impossible to stop. She did not wipe them away. She let them fall. She let them land on her hands, on her dress, on the wooden pew beneath her. She let every tear carry a piece of the weight she had been holding for 7 years. Hale paused. He looked at the cross above the altar and took a deep breath. Then he told her the rest. He told her about the mission. It was a rescue operation. Intelligence had confirmed that a group of civilians, including women and children, were being held in a compound in a remote mountain valley. The area was hostile. The enemy was well armed and well positioned. The plan was to insert the team by helicopter under cover of darkness, neutralize the threats, secure the hostages, and extract before dawn. It was supposed to be clean. It was supposed to be in and out, but nothing went the way it was supposed to. The helicopters came in low over the mountains. The night was clear and the moon was thin, which was good for concealment. Marco was in the second helicopter with 5 other operators. Hale was in the command center miles away, monitoring communications and satellite feeds. The insertion went smoothly. The team reached the compound without detection. They breached the outer wall and moved inside. The first building was clear. The second building was clear. And then, as they moved toward the third building, where the hostages were believed to be, the world exploded. The enemy had known they were coming. It was an ambush. Gunfire erupted from 3 directions at once. Rocket-propelled grenades streaked through the air. The compound lit up like daylight. The team was caught in a crossfire with almost no cover. Hale heard the radio traffic from the command center, and his blood turned cold. Men were shouting. Orders were being given and countermanded. He could hear the sound of gunfire through the headsets, not the clean, disciplined bursts of trained operators, but the chaotic roar of a fight that had gone sideways. Marco was hit within the first 2 minutes. A bullet struck his left leg above the knee. He went down but did not stay down. He dragged himself behind a low wall and continued firing. The team medic tried to reach him but was pinned by enemy fire. Marco waved him off and shouted for him to get to the hostages. He told them to go. He told them he would cover their movement, and that is exactly what he did. Wounded, bleeding, in pain, Marco Antonio Vasquez held his position and laid down suppressive fire that allowed 3 of his teammates to reach the building where the hostages were being held. He saved those men. He saved the civilians. 12 women and children walked out of that compound alive because Marco refused to stop fighting. But the cost was devastating. During the firefight, 2 more operators were hit. One was killed instantly by a grenade blast. The other was critically wounded and would die on the helicopter during extraction. And Marco, after holding his position for nearly 15 minutes with a shattered leg and diminishing ammunition, was hit a second time. The bullet struck his chest. He fell and did not get up. Hale's voice broke as he told this part. For the first time in the conversation, his composure cracked. He stopped speaking and pressed his hand over his eyes. His shoulders shook once, then twice, then went still. When he removed his hand, his eyes were red and wet and raw. He said he was sorry. He said he was sorry 100 different ways, but none of them felt like enough. He told Elena that the extraction team had reached Marco, but he was already gone. They carried him out. They'd brought him to the helicopter. They flew him to the base. And the whole time, one of his teammates held his hand, even though he could not feel it anymore. Elena sat in the pew and did not move. The tears had stopped now. Her face was still. Her eyes were fixed on a point somewhere beyond the wall of the chapel, as if she could see through it, past the base, past the ocean, all the way to that valley in the mountains where Marco had spent his last 15 minutes on Earth protecting strangers he had never met. She sat with the truth she had been waiting 7 years to hear. And the truth was both worse and better than she had imagined. Worse because the details were real and violent and final. Better because Marco had not died in confusion or fear. He had died the way he had lived. Choosing others. Choosing to give instead of take. Choosing to cover the retreat instead of saving himself. After a long silence, Elena turned to Hale and asked a question that he was not prepared for. She asked, "Did he say anything?" At the end, did he say anything at all? Hale looked at her. He looked at her for a long time, as if deciding something. Then he reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper, folded and worn and soft from years of handling. He unfolded it carefully and held it out to her. It was a note, written in Marco's handwriting. The extraction team had found it in his vest pocket. It was stained with blood and dirt. The edges were torn, but the words were still readable. It said, "Tell Elena I kept my promise. I stayed brave. Tell her the stars here are beautiful. Tell her I am looking at them right now and thinking about the night we sat on the roof of her mama's house and she told me she loved me for the first time. Tell her that was the best moment of my life. Tell her that moment is where I am going." Hale had carried that note for 7 years. He had kept it because he had never been able to find Elena. After Marco's death, the military had handled the notification and the formal proceedings. Hale had asked for Elena's contact information, but had been told it was not appropriate for a commanding officer to reach out to a widow outside of official channels. He had respected that decision, but it had haunted him. Every year on the anniversary of the mission, he took out that note and read it, and felt the weight of a promise he had not kept. He had never delivered the message until now. Elena took the note from his hands. She held it the way you hold something that might disappear if you grip it too tight. She brought it to her face and pressed it against her cheek. She could smell dust and age and something faint underneath that might have been him. She stayed like that for a long time. The chapel was completely silent. Not even the ocean made a sound. It was as if the entire world had decided to be quiet for this one moment, for this one woman, for this one piece of paper that had traveled 7 years and thousands of miles to reach the hands it was always meant for. When she finally lowered the note, she looked at Hale and said something he would never forget. She said, "Thank you for keeping him. Thank you for carrying his words when I could not." "You do not owe me an apology, Commander. You owe me nothing. My husband chose to be there. He chose to serve. He chose to give his life for people he did not know. And that is not your fault. That is who he was. That is who I married. And I would marry him again tomorrow, knowing everything I know now." Hale lowered his head. A single tear fell from his face and landed on the wooden floor of the chapel. He did not wipe it. He let it stay. Because some things are not meant to be cleaned up. Some things are meant to be left exactly where they fall, as evidence that they happened, as proof that they were real. They sat in the chapel for another hour. They did not speak much more. Sometimes silence says more than words ever could. Elena held the note in both hands and read it over and over. Hale sat across from her and breathed, and for the first time in 7 years, the air in his lungs did not feel like it was made of glass. He had finally delivered the message. He had finally told the wife what her husband had said. He had finally kept the last promise of a man who had kept all of his. When they finally stood to leave, Elena paused at the door of the chapel. She turned back to Hale and said, "There is one more thing I need to ask you. And what she asked next would change both of their lives in a way neither of them expected. Elena stood at the door of the chapel with her hand resting on the wooden frame. The light outside had changed. The morning grey had burned away, and now the sun was high and warm, spilling gold across the base and making the ocean sparkle like someone had scattered diamonds across its surface. She could hear the distant sounds of the reception still going on. Laughter, clinking glasses, the hum of families celebrating a milestone that only a handful of people in the world would ever understand. She turned back to face Commander Hale, who was still standing near the pew where he had been sitting. His eyes were tired. His face looked different now than it had on stage earlier that morning. On stage, he had looked powerful, commanding, untouchable. Now, in the quiet of this small chapel, he looked like a man who had been carrying stones in his pockets for too long and had just set a few of them down. Elena looked at him directly and said, "I need to see where the names are. The ones who did not come home. I need to see where Marco's name is written. I need to stand in front of it and see it with my own eyes." Hale understood immediately. She was talking about the memorial. Every special warfare base has one. A wall, a stone, a plaque, a place where the names of fallen operators are carved into something permanent. Not paper, not ink. Stone. Metal. Something that will last longer than memory, longer than grief, longer than the people who come to read the names. Elena wanted to stand in front of that wall and find her husband's name. She wanted to touch it. She wanted to see the proof that the world had recorded his existence, that somewhere outside of her own heart, Marco Antonio Vasquez was remembered. Hale muttered. He said, "I will take you there." They walked out of the chapel and back across the base. The sun was warm on their faces. The wind had softened to a gentle breeze that smelled like salt and eucalyptus. They did not walk fast. There was no rush anymore. The urgency of their first encounter, the shock of the tattoo, the flood of confession in the chapel, all of that had passed. What remained was something quieter, something that felt almost like peace, or at least like the first few steps toward it. They walked side by side, not speaking, and somehow that felt right. Some journeys are meant to be taken in silence. The memorial was located in a small courtyard between two older buildings on the base. It was not grand. It was not designed to impress tourists or make the evening news. It was built for the people who needed it. A low wall of dark granite stretched in a gentle curve about 4 feet high and 20 feet long. Engraved on its surface in clean white letters were names. Dozens of names. Each one followed by a rank, a team number, and a date. No details of how they died. No descriptions of their missions. Just names and dates. Because in the end, that is what matters. Not how a person died, but that they lived. That they had a name. That someone, somewhere, loved them enough to remember it. Elena approached the wall slowly. Her footsteps were so soft on the stone path that they made no sound at all. She moved along the wall from left to right, reading every single name. She did not skip any of them. She gave each one a moment of her attention, a silent acknowledgement that every name on this wall had been a person with a mother and a father and a story and a laugh and a favorite food and a place they called home. She honored them all before she reached the one she had come for. And then she found it. About 2/3 of the way along the wall, at eye level, carved in the same clean white letters as all the others. Petty Officer First Class Marco Antonio Vasquez, SEAL Team 4, and the date. The date she already knew by heart because it was the date her world had ended. She stood in front of his name and did not move. She reached out her right hand and placed her fingertips against the letters. The stone was warm from the sun. It felt alive under her touch, as if the heat had given it a pulse. She traced each letter of his name slowly, the way a person reads Braille, feeling the shape of each curve and line. The M, the A, the A, the A, the C, the O. She traced his whole name, and then she placed her entire palm flat against the wall, covering the letters as if she could hold his name in her hand, as if she could keep it safe. She stood like that for a long time. Minutes passed. Maybe 10, maybe more. Hale stood a respectful distance behind her and did not interrupt. He had watched many people stand in front of this wall. He had seen mothers collapse, He had seen fathers go rigid with anger. He had seen brothers weep and friends go silent, and children too young to understand reach up and touch the letters because they thought it was a game. But he had never seen anyone stand the way Elena stood. There was no dramatic emotion, no loud grief. There was only a woman with her hand on a wall, connected to a name, breathing in and breathing out, as if she and the stone were having a conversation that no one else could hear. When she finally turned around, her face was dry. Her eyes were clear. Something had shifted in her expression. The frozen calm that she had worn all morning like a mask had melted. What replaced it was not happiness and not sadness. It was something rarer than both. It was acceptance. The kind that does not mean you are okay with what happened. The kind that means you have decided to carry it differently. Not in your chest where it crushes you, but on your back where it becomes part of the way you stand. She looked at Hale and said, "I want to do something." He waited. She said, "Marco's letter told me not to hide. He told me to let people see me. He told me to let them know that behind every man who serves, there is someone who waits. I have been hiding for 7 years, Commander. I have been sitting in the dark in a house that is too quiet, talking to a picture on a wall. I do not want to do that anymore. I want to honor what he asked me to do. I want people to know what it costs, not just the men who fight, but the ones who stay behind and hold everything together with nothing but hope and memory." Hale looked at her with an expression that was hard to read. It was surprise and respect and something deeper, something that looked like recognition, as if he was seeing himself in her words, as if her decision to stop hiding was making him confront his own hiding, his own years of locking everything away behind rank and duty and the unspoken rule that military men do not cry, do not break, do not admit that the weight is sometimes too much. He said, "What do you want to do?" Eleanor told him. She wanted to speak. She wanted to stand in front of the families who were still gathered at the reception and tell them her story. She wanted to tell them about Marco, about the letter, about the tattoo, about the 7 years of silence. She wanted them to know that the trident their sons and husbands and brothers had just received was not just a pin. It was a promise that would be tested in ways they could not yet imagine. And she wanted them to know that no matter what happened, no matter how hard it got, they were not alone. Because there was a whole community of people who had walked this road before them. People who had waited by phones that did not ring. People who had opened doors to uniformed officers and known before a single word was spoken that their lives were about to change forever. People who had buried empty boxes and talked to headstones and held folded flags in the dark. She wanted them to know that the waiting was not nothing. The waiting was service too. Hale was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised even himself. He said, "I will introduce you." He said it simply, without hesitation, as if the decision had been made somewhere inside him before his conscious mind had a chance to debate it. He would bring her to the stage. He would stand beside her. And for the first time in his career, he would let the wall come down. Not all the way, but enough to let the light in. They walked together toward the reception area. The families were still there, spread across a grassy field dotted with white tables and folding chairs. Children were running through the grass. Plates of food were being passed around. The young SEALs were standing in clusters with their families, some of them still touching their trident pins as if to make sure they were real. When Commander Hale approached the small stage at the front of the field, people began to notice. The conversations quieted. Heads turned. The younger officers straightened up. Hale stepped onto the stage and picked up the microphone. The feedback whined for a second, then settled. He said, "I know the formal ceremony is over. I know you are all here to celebrate, and you should. Today is a day of pride and joy, and I do not want to take away from that. But there is someone here today who I believe you need to hear from." She did not plan to speak. She came here this morning just to watch. But she carries a story that every person in this crowd needs to hear. Not because it is easy, but because it is true. He paused and looked at Elena, who was standing just off the side of the stage. He extended his hand to her. She looked at it. Then she looked at the crowd. Hundreds of faces, families, strangers, people who had no idea who she was or why this decorated commander was asking them to listen to her. She took a breath. Then she took his hand, and she stepped onto the stage. She did not take the microphone right away. She stood there for a moment, looking out at the faces. She saw mothers who reminded her of herself 7 years ago, full of pride and terror in equal measure. She saw fathers trying to be strong. She saw young women holding the hands of young SEALs, not knowing yet what those hands would be asked to do, or where they would go, or whether they would come back. She saw herself in all of them, and she realized that Marco had been right. This was where she was supposed to be. Not hiding, not invisible, here. She took the microphone and began to speak. Her voice was soft at first, barely reaching the back of the crowd. But as she spoke, it grew, not louder, but deeper, firmer, like a river finding its course. She told them her name. She told them she was the widow of a Navy SEAL who had died 7 years ago on a classified mission. She told them that she had come here today because her husband had asked her to in a letter she had found just 3 weeks ago. She told them about the letter, about the words he had written, about his request that she come back to Coronado and watch and let herself be seen. She told them about the tattoo. She rolled up her sleeve and held her wrist out so that the people in the front rows could see the numbers. She told them what the coordinates meant. She told them that she had carried the location of her husband's death on her skin for 4 years because it was the only way she knew how to keep him close. The crowd was completely silent. Not a cough, not a whisper, not the rustle of a chair. Even the children had stopped running. Every single person in that field was looking at Elena Vasquez, a woman they had never met, and feeling something crack open inside their own chest. Because her story was not just her story. It was the story of every family that had ever sent someone they loved into danger and waited for them to come home. It was the story of the cost that does not show up on any budget or any report. The cost paid in sleepless nights and unanswered prayers and empty chairs at dinner tables. The cost paid in silence. Elena told them about the 7 years after Marco's death. She told them about going back to work, about teaching second graders their letters while her own world had lost all its words, about sitting in Marco's chair every night, about the flag she held in the dark. She did not dramatize it. She did not try to make them cry. She simply told the truth, and the truth was more powerful than any speech any commander had ever given from that stage. Then she told them about this morning, about sitting in the last row, about watching the new SEALs receive their tridents, about how every pin that was pressed into a young man's chest reminded her of the day Marco had received his. She told them about the wind catching her sleeve, about Commander Hale seeing the tattoo, about the chapel, about the note that Marco had written in his final moments, the note that Hale had carried for 7 years because he had never been able to find her. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out the folded, blood-stained piece of paper. She did not read it aloud. She held it up so that the crowd could see it, and she said, "My husband wrote this in the last minutes of his life. He wrote it while he was wounded and under fire. He could have used those last minutes to think about himself, to be afraid, to be angry. But he did not. He used them to write a message to me. He used them to tell me about the stars and about the night I told him I loved him. He used his last breath to love me one more time. And I want every person here to understand what that means. It means that the men and women who serve are not just warriors. They are lovers. They are dreamers. They are people who think about stars and rooftops and first kisses, even in the middle of the worst night of their lives. And the people who wait for them, the people who stand behind them, are not just waiting, they are serving too. They are holding the line at home. They are keeping the lights on and the doors open and the hearts beating for the ones who are out in the dark. And that service matters. It matters more than anyone will ever say. When she finished speaking, there was no applause. There was nothing for a long moment. And then, from somewhere in the middle of the crowd, a woman stood up. She was older, maybe in her 60s, and she was wearing a small gold star pin on her lapel, a gold star mother, a woman who had also lost a child to service. She stood up and she began to clap, slowly, one clap at a time. And then another woman stood. And then a man. And then a young SEAL in the front row who had just received his trident that morning. He stood up, and his eyes were red and his jaw was set, and he clapped so hard his palms turned pink. One by one, the entire crowd rose to its feet. The applause grew until it sounded like thunder rolling across the field. Mothers were crying. Fathers were holding their wives. Young SEALs were looking at their families with new eyes, seeing for the first time the full weight of what their loved ones were about to carry on their behalf. Commander Hale stood at the edge of the stage. He was not clapping. His arms were at his sides. His face was wet. For the first time in 30 years of service, Commander Daniel Hale was standing in front of his community with tears on his face, and he did not try to hide them, because Elena had done something that no training, no mission, no medal had ever accomplished. She had given him permission to feel. She had stood on that stage and shown the most decorated warriors in the world that strength is not about holding everything in. It is about having the courage to let it out. After the reception ended, after the families had gone home and the tables had been folded and the flags had been lowered for the evening, Hale and Elena walked together one last time. They walked down to the beach. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in layers of orange and purple and deep red. The ocean was calm. The waves came in soft and low, like breathing. They stood at the water's edge, side by side, and looked out at the horizon. Hale spoke first. He said, "I have carried the guilt of that night for 7 years. I planned that mission. I gave the order. I sent those men into that valley. And 3 of them did not come back. I have replayed it 1,000 times. Every decision, every variable, every what if. And I have never been able to forgive myself." The wind was moving her hair across her face. She pushed it back and said, "Marco's letter said something to me that I did not understand until today. He said, 'Do not hide.' I thought he meant, 'Do not hide from people.' But now I think he meant something bigger. I think he meant, 'Do not hide from life. Do not hide from pain. Do not hide from the truth.' And I think that message was not just for me. I think it was for anyone who has ever carried something too heavy alone and thought they had to keep carrying it in silence." She turned to face him fully. She said, "Commander, you did not kill my husband. The enemy killed my husband. You gave him the chance to be who he was born to be. A protector, a hero, a man who would choose others over himself every single time. If you had not planned that mission, those 12 women and children would have died in that compound. My husband saved them. Your mission saved them. And I would rather live in a world where Marco gave his life for strangers than in a world where those strangers died because no one was brave enough to try." Hale closed his eyes. The waves touched his boots and receded. When he opened his eyes again, something was different. The heaviness was not gone. It would never be fully gone, but it had shifted. It had moved from the center of his chest to somewhere farther back, somewhere he could live with, somewhere it would not crush him every time he took a breath. He said, "Thank you, Elena." She shook her head. She said, "No, thank you," for keeping his note, for telling me the truth, for standing beside me on that stage, for being brave enough to let them see you cry. They stood on the beach until the last light faded from the sky. The stars came out one by one, like candles being lit in a dark room. Elena looked up at them and smiled. It was the first real smile she had given in 7 years. Not a forced smile, not a polite smile, a real one. A smile that started somewhere deep inside and worked its way up through years of pain and silence and loneliness until it broke the surface like a swimmer coming up for air. She smiled because she was looking at the same stars Marco had written about in his last note, the same stars he had called, the same stars he was looking at when he thought about the night she told him she loved him. And she felt, for the first time in 7 years, that she was not alone, that Marco was not gone, that he was just somewhere she could not see, looking at the same sky, smiling back at her. Before she left Coronado that night, Elena did one final thing. She went back to the memorial wall. It was dark now, but small lights set into the ground illuminated the granite surface. The names glowed white against the dark stone. She knelt in front of Marco's name and placed her palm against it one last time. She whispered, "I kept my promise, my love. I came back. I let them see me. I did not hide. And now I am going to go home, and I am going to live. I am going to live the way you would have wanted me to. I am going to laugh again. I am going to open the curtains and let the light in. I am going to tell your story to anyone who will listen. And every year, on this day, I am going to come back here and put my hand on this wall and tell you about everything I have done since the last time. Because you are still here, Marco. You are in this stone and in these stars and in the ink on my wrist and in every beat of my heart. You never left. You just changed form." She stood up, smoothed her dress, and walked away from the wall. Her footsteps were steady. Her shoulders were straight. She walked across the base, past the chapel, past the training grounds, past the bleachers where she had sat that morning as a ghost. She walked out through the main gate and into the cool night air of Coronado. Her truck was parked on a side street a few blocks away. She got in, started the engine, and sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel. Then she looked at the tattoo on her wrist. The coordinates, the place where Marco had died. She touched the numbers softly with her fingertip and said out loud, "I know where you are, and now you know where I am." Then she put the truck in gear and drove. She drove east through the night, back toward Texas, back toward the house that was too quiet, back toward the life she had been surviving instead of living. But this time was different. This time, she was not driving away from something. She was driving toward something. She was driving toward the rest of her life, the life Marco had wanted for her, the life she had been too broken to believe she deserved. And 14 hours later, when she pulled into her driveway as the sun was coming up, she did something she had not done in 7 years. She opened the curtains, every single one. She let the morning light flood into the house, into the living room, into the bedroom, into the kitchen where Marco's coffee mug still sat on the shelf where he had left it. She let the light touch everything, and the house, which had been dark and quiet for so long, came alive again. Not because the silence was gone. The silence would always be there. But now it was a different kind of silence. Not the silence of grief, the silence of gratitude. The silence of a woman who had loved greatly, lost greatly, and found the courage to stand in front of the world and say, "This is who I am. This is what I carry, and I am still here." 6 months later, Elena started a foundation. She named it The Waiting Line. It was a support network for the spouses and families of military service members, both those who were still serving and those who had been lost. She traveled across the country, speaking at bases, at memorials, at community centers. She told her story everywhere she went. And everywhere she went, people listened. Not because she was loud, not because she was dramatic, but because she was honest. And honesty, real honesty, the kind that costs you something to give, is the rarest and most powerful thing in any room. Commander Hale retired from the Navy the following spring. At his retirement ceremony, he gave a short speech. He did not talk about his missions. He did not talk about his medals. He talked about a woman he had met at a graduation ceremony who had come just to watch. He talked about a tattoo that had silenced him. And he told the crowd that in 30 years of service, the bravest person he had ever met was not a SEAL. She was a wife, a teacher, a woman from a small town in Texas who had carried the weight of an entire war on the inside of her wrist and had never once asked anyone to help her carry it, until the day she stopped hiding. And that was the day she became the strongest person he had ever known. Every year, on the anniversary of Marco's death, Elena drives back to Coronado. She goes to the memorial wall. She places her hand on his name, and she talks to him. She tells him about the foundation, about the family she has helped, about the curtains that stay open now, about the laughter that has come back into the house, about the life she is living, not in spite of losing him, but because of the love he gave her while he was here. And every year when she stands at that wall with her hand on his name, she looks up at the sky, and the stars are always there. The same stars he wrote about in his last note. The same stars he called beautiful. The same stars that connect a woman in Texas to a man in the mountains across time and distance and even death itself. She looks at them, and she knows. She knows he is there. She knows he is watching. She knows he is proud. And that is enough. That has always been enough.